The trunk hulked, but the crack didn't look large enough to crawl through. Then he saw Richard's head and blinking eyes emerge from the wood, and he laughed. He was actually on Badon Hill. The sun was bright, though low, and the breeze-blown glass stroked the sides of the tall gray stone and just hid the bones that Henry knew were there. Then something jumped up and scrambled onto the rock, in front of the sun. Henry had to squint to make it out. "Blake!" he said, and laughed even more. "Richard, she's here! She has to be! Come on!" Richard was still blinking, but he could see the cat and the sky and the grass and the tops of huge wind-laced trees, and it was all beautiful. Henry was bigger than he was, so he didn't want to cry in front of him. He stood up and closed his eyes. "I like it here," he said. Henry was standing on the stone, holding Blake. Richard tried to climb up beside him, but couldn't quite make it. Henry reached down and gave him a pull. The two of them stood and looked out over the wood. "There's a lot more of the mountain than I thought," Henry said. "And a funny smell." Blake jumped out of his arms and off the rock. "It's the sea," Richard said, and he pointed to a blue expanse partially hidden by the treetops. "I've smelled it once before. You can see the water over there. We're very high. Is it an island?" "I don't know," Henry said, "but we should go. Henrietta's got a head start on us." Henry got off the rock and almost tripped on the cat. Blake stood at his feet and stared blankly at him. Then the cat ran, as much as Blake ever ran, over to the crack of the tree and disappeared, only to re-emerge and stare at Henry again. Then he ran back to the crack. "The cat wants to go back," Richard said. "We'll go back in a bit, Blake. We've got to find Henrietta first." Henry turned and began walking down the slope to an old broken wall. Richard followed him. Blake passed them both, leapt onto the rubble of the wall, and arched his back, hissing at Henry. "Stop it, Blake," Henry said. He put his hands on the wall to jump over, but pulled it back quickly, bleeding. Blake crouched, quietly now, but he had left 4 deep claw tracks across the back of Henry's hand. "Blake!" Henry yelled. "Fine, shoo, go home or whatever, but we've got to find Henrietta." He pressed his cut hand to his lips. Richard shifted nervously next to Henry. "Perhaps she's not here," he said. "If the cat's here, she's here," Henry said. "Easy enough." "Is it possible that that cat may have followed us?" Richard asked. Henry sighed. He couldn't be irritated. Frustration turned to despair. Richard could be right, and if Richard was right, then Henrietta might be lost forever. He turned to Blake. "I wish she were a dog," he said. "Where's Henrietta?" He whistled. "Find Henrietta." Blake looked insulted, but he hopped off the wall with his gray tail in the air and began walking back to the tree. Henry pulled in as much of the Badon Hill air as he could manage and listened to the breeze roll and toss too many leaves to count. The air moved gently, but the sound of its leaves' passage was strong and constant, like many waters. It felt right on his face. He could smell the moss and the soft earth and sunshine. His bone tingled with he didn't know what. Magic? Memory? He couldn't keep his eyes in one place. They kept chasing motion they couldn't quite catch. They were trying to watch the wind. "This is where I want to be," Henry thought. "Why can't you be here, Henrietta? I'm sure you're someplace awful." Henry turned and saw Richard's skinny legs kicking their way through the crack in the tree. Blake was already gone. He sighed again and dragged his toes as he walked.